I want to share the podium momentarily with my colleague, Angela Jackson Brown, who is one of the most remarkable people I have met in my career at Ball State. Her name, Angela, tells you something because it means of the angels, and she has been that for us. She was an angel that appeared at the moment that Mary and I, over a month ago, were despairing of our own lack of ability to know how to get students to come to this event. We had a pretty good idea about how to bring the generation of the 1960s here, but the whole point was to create a forum for the people of that era and the people who are on campus today, who might be the 18 to 22-year-olds, to exchange ideas and to learn from one another. This is the passing of the torch. It's time for the 60s generation to get behind those of the rising generation and to see how we can help them lead the next generation of change in this country. And like 50 years ago, we're doing something of a stress test on the presidency and find out whether the Constitution does have checks and balances that will allow our democratic experiment, barely 2 centuries old, to continue functioning. About Angela. She earned a bachelor's degree from Troy University in business administration, and her skills at organizing that come through that curriculum have been manifest in this process. She and her students took over the responsibility for the activist fair and poster session that you may have walked by, coming from Cardinal Hall B, where we had our morning sessions. Angela went on to earn a master's in English at Auburn University in '96, and a Master's in Fine Arts and Creative Writing at Spalding University in 2009. She is today an assistant teaching professor of English here at Ball State, and I first met her several years ago at an honors college retreat where both of us have been offering courses over the years, and the Honors College has been one of our premier sponsors. She is, in addition, a playwright who's produced or directed several plays. We're fortunate in a way that the one-woman play that was supposed to have opened last week, the lead and only character in that play broke her arm, so it got postponed. I feel sorry for her, but the benefit to us was that Angela was able to give us her undivided attention and not have to split it between the play in Indianapolis and here. She's a novelist, having published Drinking from a Bitter Cup in 2014. And she is a poet of the forthcoming book, House Repairs. Would you please join me in welcoming Angela Jackson Brown, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
I'm honored.
I'm honored. Who is that person? Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers of this conference for bestowing upon me the honor of introducing David Harris. What, you might ask, makes her qualified to introduce such an illustrious activist, journalist, author, and all-around amazing individual? Well, I pretty much had the same question. But after talking to Dr. Dole and Dr. Posner, I realized that they bestowed this honor upon me because they understood through various conversations that I, a former young girl from rural Alabama, got to see the after effects of World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War firsthand through the eyes of my father, MC Jackson, my uncles, and my cousins. My father was the first in our family to go to war. He was a proud young Navy seaman who fought during World War II. His younger brothers and nephews later fought in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Through them, I saw why David Harris and so many of you in this room fought hard to stop war in general, but specifically the Vietnam War. My daddy and my uncles and my cousins did not return from those wars the same boys and men that they were when they went. They lived in the Jim Crow South, and for them they only wanted to show that they too were proud Americans who wanted to do their civic duty. Little did they know the huge price that they and their families and other families would have to pay as a result of those wars. My dad and my uncles suffered from PTSD up until their deaths. Little did they know the effects of these wars, but young David Harris did know. Hence why he fought so hard as an activist and a champion for justice. As you have read in David Harris's bio, even as a younger man, something inside the very core of his being led him to fight against the parts of this country that he knew to be wrong. Whether that was through him joining the Civil Rights Movement's Mississippi Project, conducting voter registration with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or marching in his first demonstration against the Vietnam War in late 1964 upon his return to Stanford University, where he was elected the president of the Stanford University's student body, and he founded the anti-draft organization, The Resistance. No matter the cause, David Harris believed strongly that activism was exactly how it sounded, which was to put boots on the ground and to actively march and protest any and all injustices. And he did it time and time again. David Harris has published 11 books, including Dreams Die Hard, Three Men's Journey Through the Sixties, and Our War, What We Did in Vietnam and What It Did to Us. All of his books are powerful and worth reading and rereading, but I will leave you with a quote from his 1996 book, Our War, mainly because it is chillingly relevant 23 years later. David Harris wrote the following: having made lying an accepted government function, our government is now overrun with liars. Having refused to live up to our values, we are now increasingly without values. Having made killing a measure of our national efforts, we watch helplessly as killing has become one of our principal cultural currencies. Those words were awe-inspiring in 1996, but now in the year 2019, those words reveal to us that David Harris is one of our visionaries whose words we must continue to visit time and time again, lest we continue to make the same mistakes time and time again. I bring to you David Harris.
Thank you. Thank you. Damn, I better quit while I'm ahead. I'm honored to be here to share your memories. I too have a lot of memories. And like yours, a number of them are personal. But the memory I want to talk about today is the collective memory. You know, in the times that we're talking about, I kind of assumed that memory was automatic. If we did things, they would be registered and carry on through life. 50 years later, we're too old to believe that anymore. It's obvious that memory is selective. And what societies choose to remember is how they identify themselves, how they function. They provide guidelines for all of its members. And that collective memory, as we all know, has selected against the memory that we have. We are here to remember something most Americans want to forget. that as soon as those peace agreements were signed, most people walked away from. Nobody wanted to talk about. These are memories that we do not, as a rule, teach in schools. These are memories that have been attacked. As you know, the Republican Party anointed us a disease called Vietnam Syndrome for those people who had the temerity to remember what happened in Southeast Asia 50 years ago. So as we process our memory today, we should understand that it's up for grabs out there in the larger world. And the struggle that we brought to this question 50 years ago, we need to bring to the issue of how we remember it. Because the failure to remember it, the conscious failure in our society, limits us enormously. We are unable to learn the lessons we ought to learn. We are unable to process the information that war generated until we are willing to accept it as our own and to look at it full square in the face. And that responsibility for presenting that memory falls on us in rooms like this all around the country once again. And so I'm here today to talk about advocating that memory and installing it in its proper place where all Americans can learn from one of the darkest chapters in our nation's history. It's not that anybody wants to look at that dark chapter because it's dark, but it's ours. And the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we'll be able to get past it. And if we do not recognize it, we will never get past it. We will be a giant pile of unprocessed information doomed to have to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat until we finally learn how to step out of that process. So today I want to present a kind of instant memory package for us to present to the larger society around us. And there are three pillars to that memory that we have to advocate for. The first of those pillars is that the war was wrong. Not just because it was a disaster, because it certainly was a disaster. Not just because it was short-sighted or a failure or any of the number of adjectives we could apply to it. It was all of those things, but it was much more than that. It was a moral transgression of the first order. It lessened everything and everyone it touched. It highlighted the discrepancy between who we thought we were and who we behaved like. And it continues today to cast a shadow over us and over the nation's soul. And we continue to be captive to that. Let us be clear. We went 10,000 miles from home and killed 3 million people for no good reason at all. This is not just a mistake. This is not something you say, oops, to. 3 million dead do not allow that and must be accounted for. This was a fight that we picked. There was no act against us to make us go 10,000 miles from home to do this. This war had already been fought before we ever got involved in it. The Vietnamese had fought the French colonialists and defeated them and signed a treaty that said Vietnam was to be divided in half for the purpose of withdrawing troops and then united in a free election. And it was apparent to everybody at the time, if such a free election were held amongst the Vietnamese, that Ho Chi Minh would be elected president of Vietnam. He was their George Washington. He was their national hero. He would have swept through the polls with 90% of the vote. But he was a communist. And we had this thing going about communism. And as a consequence, we refused to recognize that treaty. We refused to allow it to be carried out. We installed a puppet government, and this war then had to recommence and go through a whole nother chapter, just as it had with the French. This war was a lie from beginning to end. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, taken after the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident, was manufactured. It had no substance in reality. There was a blip on a radar screen in an American ship off the coast of North Vietnam that someone said maybe that was a missile that was fired at us, although nobody ever saw the missile, nobody ever saw the ship that did it. All they had was a blip on a radar screen. And within 24 hours of having reported that to Washington, D.C., the people on the spot reported back to Washington, D.C. that there was no proof that this had been an attack. By that time, Lyndon Johnson had seized on this purported attack and used it as an excuse to go to Congress and ask for the only rationale for and permission ever granted for the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which passed with only 2 dissenting votes in all of Congress. But it was a lie, and the policy we continued to pursue after that was based on lies, over and over again from the government. You had a government that was selling this war constantly when it already knew the war was unwinnable. Robert McNamara has, in his memoirs, stated very clearly that by 1966 he knew this war was unwinnable and had to be abandoned, but said nothing. You know, one of the highlights of the anti-war movement was the Pentagon Papers release. And the thing that made the Pentagon Papers release so important was it demonstrated that indeed the government had been lying to us all along the way. And it not only had been lying, it knew it was lying. This was not a mistake. And this war, of course, was tainted with that throughout its 10-year length. And this war had nothing to do with democracy. The Republic of South Vietnam was about as democratic as Mussolini's Italy. There was no free election ever held for this government. Its principal occupation was stealing as much money as it could and trafficking in heroin that eventually ended up in the arms of American soldiers. And our effort there was one of arrogance from front to back. There was arrogance in the initial premise of the war, which was somehow that we as Americans were qualified to go anywhere on the planet and tell them how they were supposed to govern themselves. That Americans were somehow so special that we could go to a place who we only knew about through a few articles in National Geographic, had no grasp of their history, no grasp of their culture, no grasp of who they were and what they faced, and walk in and pick their government for them and blow them apart if they didn't accept the government that we picked. Can you imagine something more arrogant than that? But there was more arrogance to go with it, and starting with a whole pile of racial arrogance. Our president, Lyndon Johnson, when he was the leader of the Senate, described the Vietnamese as a bunch of little slant-eyed carrying pocket knives. We, as a people, described them as ginks and slopes. We brought no respect to this, and we brought a sense of racial superiority. We believed that we were going to walk into this country who had a history of thousands of years of resistance to invaders, and we were just going to kick their ass left, right, and sideways and come home in 6 months, because who were they? And who were we? Not a chance. 6 months later, it was, well, another 6 months. 6 months after that, well, maybe a year. 6 months after that, well, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. And it went on and on and on. And these people who we thought were so inferior to us gave us a whipping out in the tall grass that we have never come to terms with. We believed that somehow we could do no wrong in this. But we did do wrong on an enormous scale. And in so doing, we contradicted everything we thought Americans were supposed to be, that we all experienced. You know, the anti-war movement that I was a part of was full of people who got A's in junior high school civics. We knew what America was supposed to be. It was quite clear. You know, we grew up watching Victory at Sea on the television, and we listened to our father's stories from World War II, and we knew that Americans were supposed to save those who were helpless to save themselves. We knew that America was supposed to stand up for right and justice wherever it appeared. That was what Americans did. But that's not what Americans did in Vietnam. Not in the least. We waged war on an entire population. We were faced with an enemy that swam in the population like fish in the sea, which was successfully fighting a guerrilla action because it had the support of the population that allowed it to hit and hide and hit and hide and hit and hide. And to address that kind of strategy, we developed strategies of our own, like search and destroy, where American troops would simply go into a village, try and find some suspects who they could label as Viet Cong, and then burn down the huts that they found them in and move on over and over again. The worst of those cases we all remember as My Lai, where a company from the Americal Division went into this hamlet known as My Lai and killed over 500 people for no reason. They faced, the only American casualty in the operation was one soldier who accidentally shot himself in the foot. Otherwise, it was women and children and old men thrown into ditches and executed out of hand. And that was not the only one of those massacres. There were dozens of them. And it doesn't sound like the America that we were supposed to be. We also practiced forcible relocation, where we took entire villages in a culture in which being in the presence of the graves of your ancestors was one of the highest spiritual callings. We forced them out of those villages into villages that we could control and did control. When that still didn't work, we acted to make the countryside uninhabitable. We did that with defoliation, spraying Agent Orange on jungles so that there were no leaves left in the jungle that could obscure our enemies from us. We did that with a strategy known as carpet bombing, where we took the map, we divided it into grids, we sent up B-52s, and we saturated one part of the grid with anti-personnel weapons, with no idea who was down there, what was down there, no such thing as a target, just the idea of driving the population out of the countryside into the cities where they thought we could control them. The apex of that mentality was a weapon called the plastic fragmentation bomb. The fragmentation bomb was a large cylinder that, when released from the B-52, would open up and disgorge 100 or so small bomblets that would then explode 10 feet off the ground, making an area the size of several football fields a complete killing zone from fragmentation. And in the Pentagon studies about this process, they came to the conclusion that better than having a weapon like this that just killed people outright, it was a much better strategy to wound people, because it took only one of their soldiers to deal with a dead soldier. It took 5 of their soldiers to deal with a live wounded one. So with the idea of sapping our enemies, we set out to wound them. And the ultimate wounding device was the plastic fragmentation bomb, because not only would it wound them, its wounds would be undetectable by an X-ray machine, making it all that much harder on our enemies, as we thought. This didn't sound like the America that I grew up with. This sounded like the people that we prosecuted at the end of World War II and jailed, and in some case executed. And perhaps the greatest violation, at least for me personally, was the implementation of torture as a policy, which began in Vietnam. I remember in 1966 sitting in on a trial of a draft resistor in San Jose, California, who, as one of his defense witnesses, called a sergeant who had just been discharged and returned from Vietnam. And he described how it worked out in the field. In those days, they were carrying those crank telephones, you know, you've all seen in the movies where you crank it up and talk. He said when they captured someone they thought was a Viet Cong, they would disconnect the telephone from the generator, take the leads from the generator, and attach them to the suspect's testicles, and then crank it up. And their saying about that used to be, we dial him up, he rings. And that mentality continued apace and even grew. By 1971, as part of the Phoenix Project, the United States built 44 regional torture centers around Vietnam where suspects could be tortured. Out there in the documentation behind all of this, there's a letter from one of the CIA officers who was being housed at this one of the detention centers, complaining that there was no way for him to get to sleep because people were screaming all night long. Now, this was Americans? I was raised to believe that this is what Nazis did. This is what Soviets did. This was not what Americans did. But sure enough, we did. And we did it over and over and over again, and we knew exactly what we were doing. And when we left, we had a solid 10 years of this kind of behavior behind us. Of course we don't want to remember. I don't want to remember. You don't want to remember. All those people out there don't want to remember. But we have an obligation. If we don't own this, it will own us. And it has owned us for the last 50 years. Need I mention Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria? Come on. We are stuck. We are like one of those old 33 and a third discs with a big scratch in it, and we're in this constant reset going right back to the same spot because we will not admit to ourselves that we have engaged in evil. You know, the phrase is, my country, right or wrong. I endorse that sentiment totally. But the issue for us as Americans is, what do you do when it's wrong? We have lots of clear instructions about what to do when it's right. But when it's wrong, we were left on our own to deal with that. And we're still in that position. And as we foster this memory and try to make it stay alive, it's essential for our own national character that we do so. Without that memory, we are doomed to repeat. And the memory itself is clear. The second part of my instant memory plan is about the accounting for all of this. And I think the premise that we have to advance, all of us, is that we are all responsible. We cannot blame this on the men who were ordered by our government to go carry it out. We can't just blame it on the government that gave the orders. We are a democracy. Any action taken by the state is an action on all of us, that all of us are responsible for, that all of us have to account for. That's the way modern states work. There are no innocent bystanders. When a policy is pursued, your implicit approval is there in your citizenship. And if you want to disapprove of it, then you have to step out. And you have to assume responsibility, not just in the aftermath, although certainly we now need to do that in the aftermath, but we needed to do that in the present tense of that war as well. We were all responsible. We were responsible as citizens. In a democracy, citizens have to embody that democracy. Without them, there is no democracy. We are responsible as human beings, part of a species that for whom life is always too short. And the implicit understanding between all of us human beings is that we won't kill people for no good reason, because we are all part of the same species. Well, we violated that responsibility. And we have a responsibility just simply as human beings, as individual persons, in terms of what kind of people do you want to be? Do you want to be the kind of people that turns the other way while napalm consumes children and families and villages? Do you want to be the kind of people that stands back and closes its eyes and says, see no evil? Or do you want to be a person who identifies and stands up for those who are suffering at our hands? That was certainly the decision I made. I marched against the war for the first time when I was 18 years old. I participated in the last demonstration that I was ever in against the Vietnam War when I was 28. I spent 20 months in the federal prison system during that 10 years. And I did so for having committed civil disobedience against military conscription and organized other people to do likewise. And that was my attempt to exercise my responsibility. And I think that's the call we have to make to America, and we made at the time. Which brings me, of course, to my third pillar of that memory. And that is, when we remember the war, one of the things we must remember about it is that it stopped because of a citizens' movement that rose up and made it eventually politically impossible for the government to continue the policy. For the only time in American history, a group of citizens stopped a war. And I don't know about you, but I'm damn proud of that. I think we saved the country's soul for a little bit there anyway. I think when the country needed somebody to stand up for what it really was, we were there. When the country needed somebody to not allow it to go ahead with business as usual, we were there. When the country needed someone to stand up to and speak truth to power, we were there. I think we deserve a vote of thanks from our country, which we won't get. So I'm going to give it right now. Thank you. Thank you for all the moratoriums out there. We started as just a little group of students at this campus and that campus, and we became a movement that eventually brought millions of people out into the street. And that is a heritage. And that heritage we should nurture along with that larger memory. And out of that heritage, there are some lessons to pass on. And I have a short list of those. The first thing that we discovered in that movement is that people change. The thing about the anti-war movement is that everybody who was in it had to get there by changing their mind. And they did. And throughout that history, from small to big, people changed their minds. And they changed their minds because when we were at our best as a movement, we did not draw a line in the sand and say you're with us or against us. We had an open door, and our response to everybody was join us. The police that we encountered was join us. This government spokesman we encountered, it was join us. And it's always got to be join us. If you're going to have a movement, then you have to have that openness to bring other people into it, which means you can't be calling them names and threatening to kill them. Second is a basic rule that we learned, which is you get what you do. You don't get what you talk about. You don't get your rhetoric. You get what you do. You know, the most famous quote, perhaps, from that whole Vietnam experience was from a captain who had just finished having his troops burn down a village, and he explained to a reporter who was there that he had been forced to destroy the village in order to save it. That was the logic that these kinds of wars operate under. All that was left was no village. Nothing was saved in that process. And means are just ends in motion. And ends are just means in a static position. We get what we do, not what we talk about, not how we explain it, not by our rationale. If it's hurt we administer, it's hurt that we are left with. Third, you can't change things without taking risks. It's just the way the math works. And I want to encourage everybody to take risks, because it's not nearly as dangerous a proposition as you would think. I certainly took my share of risks back then, and I'm glad to have done so. And I think movements that are ready to take risks are movements that are ready to expand. Fourth thing is, we should understand that you're never alone. You know, for every person, there are 10 people who are watching them as we all try to figure out what to do with the lives that we have in our hands. Everybody's got a constituency, and that's the beginning of politics, is the people that you contact every day. And when you take a step out in public, it's with them in mind. And so don't despair. And we should understand that we are never powerless. In worst case scenario, you always have control over yourself and your actions. You always have that power. We used to say in the joint, they've got our bodies, but they can only get our minds if we give them to them. And so it is in this kind of society. And finally, democracies work because citizens take it personally. This is not about abstract politics. This is about who are you and how are you going to behave towards the other people who are like you. This is a personal matter for all of us. And I look back on that history that we were all shared, and I take it personally. And all the people in that movement that I respected all took it personally. It's about who you are. And the rest, the other questions just line up behind that. So thank you. And we'll take a few questions and answers, or do we have time left for that?